Hi there, welcome to Boxing Deep Dive. I'm Lyndon Hosking, and as always, great to have you along for an episode of Classic Fights. And we've got something a little bit different in this episode because our main man that I'll bring on in a second here has come up with something from the past. And when I say the past, I'm talking the past. Let's get our guests, our co-hosts in for this episode. As always, Grant Tassie Brown and the walking encyclopedia himself, Mike Altamura. How are you, mate?
Good, thanks.
Yeah, I'm great. I'm happy to be introducing the audience to a fight that they probably wouldn't ordinarily go back and watch, but I know that during my upbringing, this was one of those fights that was always discussed on any kind of classic fights perspectives of the best fights of the 20th century. This was always in the mix as basically a top 10 bout, arguably one of the greatest heavyweight fights of all time, and looking forward to kind of delving into why that was the case.
Yeah, well, Tassie, now, as I said, we're going way back in time here. I'll bring the fight up in a second, although everyone's that's logging in obviously already knows what it is. But, mate, we've had them, I think the latest we've gone back might be the 70s, and this one we're going back to the 40s, if you can believe it.
Mate, this fight was part of my upbringing. Joe Louis had a very, very tough fight against Billy Conn, probably one of the greatest light heavyweights ever. But he wasn't really meant to give Joe Louis a tougher fight like he did. He was a smaller man. He was a boxer. But people will see he literally gives Joe Louis a boxing lesson until he gets caught. So, yeah. And this is why one of the reasons him and Jersey Joe Walcott, why as much as I love Joe Louis, I know Mike disagreed when we had our top 10 heavyweights, I've got Ali beating Joe because, as I said, if Joe can be outboxed by the likes of Billy Conn, who's really just a light heavyweight, and guys like Jersey Joe Walcott, I've got Ali outboxing Lewis. But anyway, look, it's a history fight. They had two fights. This is obviously the first one, but Billy Conn puts on a very good display of boxing until later in the fight.
Well, Mike, as Tassie said, we're on to, this is your choice for the week. It's Joe Louis versus Billy Conn, number one. It took place on June 18th, 1941. So a long, long time ago at Yankee Stadium in New York. And what a time it was to be alive back then. So, Mike, first of all, why'd you choose this fight? Tassie's obviously just touched on it there. Why'd you choose this fight and what made this fight so classic?
Simply because it's got all the aspects that we love about boxing. It's one of the greatest contrasts you could ever see. So Billy Conn comes into the fight. I'm just bringing up his record here. So he's 58-9-1. He had been a long-reigning light heavyweight world champion, undefeated for 3 years. And the prior year and a half, he had almost exclusively fought heavyweights. Beat some of the best heavyweights of his time, like Bob Pastor, Al McCoy, Lee Savold, Gunnar Barlin. It actually led to him being declared, even though Joe Louis was the man at heavyweight, Billy Conn was the Ring Magazine Fighter of the Year in 1940. Joe Louis was the Ring Magazine Fighter of the Year in 38 and 39. So this was an era where the heavyweight champion of the world was really the king of all sports. It was a completely different context. Like if you think about it nowadays, it's extremely rare the last 25, 30 years for a heavyweight champion to be the consensus fighter of the year across the board in the sport. But it gives you a little bit of a contrast. So Louis, 49-1 going in, knockout machine. This was considered to be one of the toughest challenges of his title reign, despite the fact that Conn, you look at the weights leading in, Louis weighed in 199, Conn 174. There's been discussions that maybe the weights were even a greater adjustment than that. You know, there's people that said that Louis was in the low 200s, maybe about 205, and that Conn was barely 170. Irrespective, 25 pounds is 25 pounds. It's in this day and age a light heavyweight against a cruiserweight. But the fight had a bit of everything, and it's one of the first fights of Lewis's reign where, although both guys were so likable. Conn, the fighting pride of Pittsburgh, so of course, only a state over from New York, where this was stationed at the at the Polo Grounds. First major fight at the Polo Grounds really since Jack Dempsey and Firpo. Did over 54,000 people crowd. So that kind of reflects what a spectacle it was. But this was one of the few fights of Lewis's reign to this point where he wasn't quite the protagonist, if that makes sense. Like, both guys were real likable characters. And I think that, Lewis was always a gentleman. He was never going to be the kind of guy to talk trash or anything in the fight. But, Conn had a lot of support leading into the bout. Lewis was an 11 to 5 favourite. But a lot of people felt that Conn could box and move. And he was a brilliant tactical fighter defensively, really good speed, really good skills. And, people knew that even though Lewis had built so well since Schmeling, they knew that if you could just avoid his right hand and stick on the outside and make him miss, that there was openings to hit him. Lewis was always prepared to take 2 or 3 to land one because of the faith he had in his power. So, it's probably the most intelligent fighter that Lewis would encounter in his career. Like I said, Conn, 13 knockouts in 58 wins. So he was going to have to play the percentages and be perfect for 15 rounds. And I think that that's what made it such a great fight. And as we'll discuss once we review the bout, it's why it goes down as one of the best fights in boxing history, because all the contrasts and all the stylistic things we love to see in fights, boxer versus puncher, champion versus champion, the best versus the best in their prime. This was it. You got Joe Louis, 27 years of age. You got, Billy Conn, 27. Joe Louis, 23 years of age. Absolute primes. Previous 3 years, these two guys were the only guys in discussion for Fighter of the Year talks. So, absolute pound for pound best, 1 and 2 arguably fighting one another. So yeah, let's get to it.
And I've got to apologise there. I actually had Yankee Stadium written down. That was the second fight, so apologies for that. Thanks for correcting me. I was just on there thinking, geez, I must have missed that. And I'm on the records now, and you're 100% right. The Polo Grounds in New York. So I got the date right. That's the main thing. Now, 1941. I'm not great with my history. Was that the start of World War II? Was it 1941?
Well, it's 39, but it was leading to, and this is something we'll talk about post-fact in this bout,
Yep.
But it was leading to what would see to be a hiatus period, basically the next, from 42 to late 44, early 45, the boxing scene really deteriorated in the United States due to either fighters being conscripted or it just not being financially feasible for promoters to stage bouts during a war period. So, this was really one of the last great fights before that hiatus was to come and undoubtedly affect the careers of both gentlemen.
And Tassie, in this fight, Joe Louis had 17 successful defences, 15 by knockouts. He obviously needed the challenge because I think, and Mike, you can correct me if I'm wrong here in a minute, but it was the Bum of the Month club that he was in the process of going through when he couldn't actually find any legitimate challenges. He was just fighting, and he fought regularly. I mean, I can't believe how regularly these guys fought back in the day, but the Bum of the Month club, they called it, because they simply couldn't find a worthwhile challenger, and in this fight, he got what they wanted.
Yeah, well, I remember one of the Bone of the Months club. He almost he got dropped twice by tough. What was his name again? Mike.
Two-ton Tony Galento.
Yeah. But I mean, look, yeah, Lewis was a great champion. He was very active and he reigned for many years. And like I mentioned before, at the dinner table, my grandfather was always he liked the boxer, so he liked Conn. My dad always liked the puncher. He liked Lewis. So again, I've heard a lot about this fight and the different styles and my grandfather was I think was obviously a fan of Conn's at the time and dad of Lewis and so look, it was obviously a great bout, like Mike said, two arguably the best of the era. At the time, Ring Magazine voted and Conn was obviously beating other heavyweights and good heavyweights and he took on arguably one or two greatest heavyweights of all time, so and he fared fairly well against him.
Yeah, so Mike, I'll get the fight started here and we'll set the scene. Now, I'm right, there was nearly 60,000 people at this fight. Am I right? I think that's what I read. It just would have been an amazing atmosphere.
Just over 54,000, yeah.
54. Okay, so
Isn't it different now? They try their ass off. They work hard to get 10, and now look at that back in the day.
Yeah.
True boxing fans.
And think about this. Think about this too. This is Joe Louis. We're in June here. Joe Louis's 6th fight of 1941 and Billy Conn's 5th.
Amazing. And we're in June.
True fighters.
Yeah, it's just amazing, isn't it? So again, set the scene for us here, though, when I said about the Bum of the Month Club here, Mike. So how many, I think I said he had 17 defences, 15 by knockout. So what was the appeal of Billy Conn coming up? Obviously, he was a light heavyweight champion, but did people actually give him a chance, or his performance just surprised everybody?
Yeah, like I said, I mean, Louis was an 11-5 favourite, but realistically, if you look at 11-5, it's just a tad over a 3-1 favourite. Louis against a lot of these other guys, like against Al McCoy, for example, he was like a 50-1 favourite, 50-1 on. So this was considered a genuine challenge, and that's what I was saying. Like, realistically, probably since the Schmeling rematch, this was considered to be really his toughest defence, because Conn was highly regarded, like I said, consensus fight of the year prior in the industry, and it tactically played into his hands, Louis. You know, people knew that, as you said here, I mean, look, fighting's evolved so much in 80 years, and this is where, you know, Tazzy and I had that discussion about Louis and Ali. I'm not talking about who would win the fight. I feel like Louis's legacy as a heavyweight was greater than Ali's as a champion, you know, because you can't really match eras stylistically. Sports evolve, things evolve, which is why even the 100 meters, we're not talking about breaking 10 seconds as being a big feat anymore, you know. But you see here with Conn, very patient, trying to bait Louis into a trap and frustrate him, get him to overcommit, and then look to counter and move. But what happened was, in around the 3rd round, Conn actually was able to shake up Louis and had a bit of success fleetingly at moments, was leading the bout going into the later stages, and progressively was becoming a little bit more confident that maybe he could even get Louis out of there, in spite of the fact that he had only like a 15% knockout record.
Yeah, and Tazzy, Mike just hit it on the head then. It was the I suppose the downfall of Billy Conn. He'd fought so well, and the scorecards after 12 rounds, by the way, I think this is the 12th round here. Billy Conn was in front 7 rounds to 5 and 1, 7 rounds to 4 on the other, and the other one had it 6 rounds to 6. So in this day and age, he would have won a 12-round decision, which is funny to think of. But as we'll see in a second, he got brave like a lot of fighters do. Probably their intentions outweighed their abilities, and he paid the price.
It happens, mate. It's part of boxing. I mean, Hearns would have beat Leonard if it was a 12-round fight, but it's 15 back then, mate, so that's the way it is.
And Mike, so we're in the 12th here. This is after the 12th, so they go back to the corner. As I said, Billy Conn's in front until of the 3 scorecards. He wasn't 100% home if he had won the final 3 rounds, but well on his way. All he had to do was win one more round and he would have won the fight if it went the distance.
Just keep boxing him. You've seen Louis there. That Conn landed a double hook that prior round and really buckled his legs. And you see even here, Louis a little twitchy, but Louis was one of those guys. He's very deceiving with his power, that he could punch short and generate genuine pop over very, very short angles, short distances. And yeah, I think Conn probably getting a little brazen, but hindsight's 20/20. You know, he still needed to take chances. Taking chances in the belt is what got him there. It's just, you know, later rounds it happens. Guys get a little bit flat-footed, and Joe was a fighter that only ever needed one punch to get you out of there.
Yeah, he was definitely a monster back then, wasn't he? But classic case here, Tazzy, that the good big man will always beat the good little man.
Yeah, that's what they say, Linda, and that's what I grew up being told. Obviously, in the boxing fraternity, a good big man always beats a good little man, and this was just another proven moment that is correct. Yes.
And Mike, obviously talk us through this little bit here, because to set the scene, he's in front, he gets brazen, he starts trying to put Joe Louis away, and talk us through the final moments.
Well, I think what's lost in history a little bit, in this round, and you've seen it reflected before our eyes, is that Lewis landed probably 5 or 6 flush uppercuts before these later exchanges that really make Conn rubber legs. So he was progressively breaking him down throughout the round, and I think that at a point, Conn's gotten to a stage that he's just basically standing a lane on him and trying to hold, but Lewis kept just separating and creating a gap, and that's what created the opening for that secondary right hand there, and that's all she wrote, as they say.
And Tassie, not that I've been there, and I'm sure you guys haven't either, but you'd think at the third, after 12 rounds into the 13th round, you get dropped by that shot. Pretty tough, to try and will your body to get up and go on, because he just would have been absolutely exhausted.
100%, mate. Once fatigue kicks in and you've took a lot of blows over the fight, it takes a lot of heart and courage to get up from that punishment.
All right, Mike. So after this fight, now looking at the records here, Billy Conn, they fought again in 1946. Joe Lewis got an 8th round knockout this time. He only fought another couple of times after that, but Joe Lewis would fight for another 10 years.
Yeah, it's incredible. So they were scheduled for a rematch in 1942, and the rematch was postponed. From memory, there was an injury on Conn's side of the fence, and then what happened is both fighters were conscripted for war. They actually had a couple of exhibitions while serving the troops and entertaining the troops. So shows you kind of what mateship these two maintained outside of the ring too. And I think that what's lost when people historically look at the rematch is that it was 4 years between drinks in terms of professional contests for Conn. He had those exhibitions during the war period and so forth, but his prior bout was 1942, and then he's gone into, a rematch with Lewis 4 years later, completely cold. So anyone in this day and age who talks about requiring a tune-up or whatever, look, I'm all for him, but this guy literally stepped inside with the man I consider the greatest heavyweight of all time, off a 4-year layoff. That's, basically, I think by the stage he was in there, it was almost like a 1,550-day layoff. Stepped in against Lewis, and obviously it didn't shake his way. He got knocked out in the 8th round. He picked up a couple more wins, and then they actually had a few more exhibitions post-career just for entertainment purposes. And, Billy Conn always looked back upon the first bout with Lewis as a missed opportunity, but I think he was able to live with himself because he had a humorous way of kind of, playing it out. And he said, I remember in the post-fight, he said, what's the good of being Irish if you can't be thick? So, he had that kind of style and that manner about him. And I know that another exchange was, he said to Lewis, couldn't you allow me to reign as heavyweight champ just for 6 months? And Joe responded, well, I gave you the title for 12 rounds and you couldn't even hold on to it from there. So,
good point,
I think that when you think of the banter and the kind of nonsense that fighters talk in this era, and then you see how gentlemanly these two were, I think you can see that it was, the makeup was from a completely different era. And even though Billy Conn, he retired after 2 quick victories. He was 30, was he 31 or just on 32 years of age when he stepped out his last bout. In that era for a light heavy come heavyweight, that was considered relatively senior. So it's not like as though people felt he left in his prime. People felt his best days were possibly just behind him. But like you said for Joe Lewis, he went on to have an absolutely stellar run following this bout. He never really maintained the same work rate and number of defenses, like he did pre-war. But there's a reason why he went down as, like I said, in my book, the greatest heavyweight of all time. And in everyone's book, if it's not him, it's Ali and then him.
Yeah, I think you can make an argument for either one. But
and just to touch on about that crowd that they had, it just shows it shows how boxing's declined and boxing's not that popular these days. And boxing hasn't evolved at all. Boxing's gotten worse. Boxing, if they're getting 60,000 people back then for that fight, what's the heavyweight title get now? What is Fury Wilder? What do they get? 10, 15?
10 or 15, yeah.
Tyson at his best, what was he getting?
Yeah, or 15, yeah.
I mean,
So
like, look, in this era, one-off fights can pack out stadiums and build crowds like that. But I think what you're saying, which is true too, you look at the context of what was able to raise, and what I should have done was looked at the gate receipts. But the gate for this fight done $468,000 thereabouts in 1941. That's
yeah,
that's an outrageous sum by any calculation in any era. When you look at what 1941 currency was worth to now, it's outrageous, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
but and that's
sorry,
the
mate.
thing though. But like, that's what shits me though. This boxing, yeah, boxing is shit these days. It's fucked.
To
Look
be,
compared
yeah.
to then. Like,
To be fair though,
I know there's more things going on. There's
yeah.
more distractions and all that, but it just goes to show you, boxing back then, and in Australia, we've hit Patrick Ford, Tommy Burns, packed out, couldn't get a. They're outside of the radio because they couldn't get a ticket. I don't want to hear that boxing's evolved because it hasn't.
Yeah, I think
All right,
just
so looking at
Mike.
adjusting for inflation, $468,000 USD in that era would be times by 22 now. So when you look at that, it's essentially over a $10 million gate that these two generated.
which is pretty good. But I mean, on the crowd thing, I mean, to be fair, I mean, obviously, lifestyles have changed a bit since then, but I think a Mayweather Pacquiao or one of those types of fights probably would have drawn that sort of crowd. So I think if it was the event's big enough, it's still there. But having said that, back in the day, there was no social media. There wasn't, the saturation of sports shows and all the rest of it. But
They were true boxing fans too, though. They were true. Like people love the fights, even in Australia, going back, you just go and watch. Like, I think we spoke about Peter. You just go and watch the fights. They just get a ticket. Wasn't the tables or the bullshit now. You just go and watch the fight. Your regular. It's changed. I won't listen to anyone. I don't care who it is or not, except that boxing's evolved. It's gotten worse, and the boxing fans aren't there.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you're right, and and Mike, with Tazzy's right there too. That it used to just be a Friday night or a Saturday night thing, or in some cases a Monday night thing, where it was just we go to the fights. We go to the pub and then we go to the fights, and
you go with your dad. Beautiful.
Yeah, I think, like you said, I think a lot of things have changed. I think that other sports have evolved and become global. Like, so you go back, if you really look at 1941 America, there's no NBA. There's no National Hockey League. There's no nationalisation of gridiron. There's no gridiron stars in that day. There was baseball and there was boxing. And if you look at then the proliferation of these other sports, it attracts the super athletes where there's a spread. LeBron James might have been a heavyweight boxer. If you look at it like that, Michael Jordan might have been a cruiserweight.
Yeah.
If you look at it realistically of the changes in era. So, and then I just think that in society there's more to do. But I think that boxing lost a lot of its prestige, and I think you got to put that down to kind of what came out of this era too as well. I think that a lot of the heavy mob influence in the late 40s, especially in the late 40s, getting exposed coming into the 50s, I think fragmented a lot of the sport. And I think that then that trickled down to other sports emerging and evolving and gradually growing. And that's part of life. I think that, if you look at the spread now, boxers are still amongst the highest earning athletes in the world, but it's very, very few. Whereas, back in those days, and if we want to Australianize this a bit, like a 6 to 8 round prelim fighter, so to speak, was earning more than, AFL footballers. Well, back then VFL, but, like a 6 to 8 round, just your regular opponent was making more than footballers in that era. So I think a lot of things have changed, and, with trends, things adjust. But, being a throwback fight fan, I would have loved to live and relish and intake those days where it just seemed like things in the sport were so much more pure.
They were
100%.
And
Mike, can I just touch on Lyndon?
Yep.
Mike, what's the meaning behind the beanie? It says "Daddy."
I don't know if that's appropriate for this program, but it's nothing dirty or anything. But
do you like being called
it's
daddy? Or
no, it's reflective of, you know,
Who's
being
your
in a
daddy?
position that I've needed to father so many, you know, sly talking people in Australian boxing over the last 20 years. But, you know, we can delve into that on another podcast and another time. For this particular podcast, let's just keep the focus on these classic bouts.
Well, before we get to you, Tassie, with next week, if you've got someone there, the thing to remember here, Mike, is that it took, another 40, after this one, 45 years it was, before a light heavyweight actually won the heavyweight crown. That was, of course, Michael Spinks upsetting, actually might have been 1985, upset Larry Holmes for the world title, and then backed it up a few months later. So that's how long it took, 44 years for it to happen, and there's been a few attempts since then. So, and he was this close.
Yeah, and again, you know, like when you look at the size discrepancy, even though Conn was fighting heavyweights, he still maintained his size at light heavyweight while fighting the heavyweights. In this day and age, he would have had a strength and conditioning trainer. He would have done like Usyk. You know, you have 1 or 2 fights, you transition, you build up in weight, you come in at 215, 220 pounds, like Usyk, like Holyfield, like all these
Spinks
guys.
did.
But yeah, Spinks as well. Spinks brought in the great Mackie Shilston and built to about 210 pounds of muscle. But
look good.
Yeah, it was just a completely different era, and you know, some things were a little backward back then. But you also got to respect the fact that guys like Billy Conn, or even, you know, Sugar Ray Robinson, when Robinson stepped in and fought for the light heavyweight title, he fought for the light heavyweight title, but he weighed in at middleweight. So they genuinely were stepping out of their weight classes. And, you know, we always talk about catch weights. There was no catch weights. There was no rehydration clauses, nothing.
Yeah, it's the way it should be. But, look, I suppose one thing I do like about your choice in this, Mike, is that it's giving a lot of our younger or maybe new to the sport, you know, a real reason to go back and do these fights, because there were so many great fights back in the day. And I really like, you've gone back to the 40s, and maybe we can, you know, we can start choosing a few from the 40s, 50s and 60s, etc., because there's plenty of great fights out there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was an era where, and not only the positive that there was fights, it really is that first era where there's a volume of fights. You know, you can look at, you know, for guys that were on pound for pound list, Henry Armstrong, Sugar Ray Robinson, to, you know, great fights coming into the early 50s, I believe, with Basilio and Tony DeMarco, their 2 bouts. Like, a lot of that footage is resurfaced, and you can find freely online in its entirety, not just highlights, but you can find a full 12, 15 round bout from that era. And you look at the styles of fights, and even when fights were more technical based, they were still pleasing to the eye to watch for the most part. There was very few fights that you look at back in that era where you look at it and say, that was stylistically a fizzer, because the referee wouldn't tolerate it. The referee wouldn't let guys just dance around the ring and touch and move. You know, they'd be encouraged to fight, and if they didn't fight, he would usually toss them out. But the fighters were real craftsmen. You go back, look at, say, the likes of Archie Moore versus Yvonne Durrell, which is probably another fight that we'll do here in future as well. I don't want to spoil what happens in that, but there's countless fights. The series of, you know, Tony Zale versus Rocky Graziano. I just think that, you know, sometimes in boxing history, and, you know, we all get attracted to the sport because clearly we're fans and advocates, but we come from different walks of life, whether you're a fighter or trainer or just someone who likes to get down to the pub and watch the latest fights whenever they're on, or Fox Sports or whatever. I think that we all have a tendency sometimes to neglect the past. And, you know, some people, their past might only trickle from now to 1990, and they think that it's throwback because they're watching fights from the 90s, they're watching Roy Jones highlights or whatever. And I would always encourage everybody to learn the history of the sport. You're always evolving. There's always things that you can add to your knowledge base, and we're in the best era ever because there's so much available to you online. You can literally do yourself a favor, go on the Ring Magazine website, look up Ring Magazine Fight of the Year, going back 100 years, Google every single fight on there. You'll find the absolute majority, even fights in the 20s, you at least find a clip, go back and appreciate what it was. Think that, that's what I encourage everyone, because
Yeah.
you want to have a real perspective of what the sport historically has meant and how it's evolved.
No, very well said, mate. And for sure, if you're out there watching this show, of course, go back on YouTube. There's plenty of great fights on there, and like you said, go back through the Ring magazine, best fights of the year for 100 years, and most likely they're all going to be on YouTube. So check them out. So Tassie, we're back to you. Have you had a bit of a think about who you're going to have for next week?
Yeah, I'm going to go along with Mike's sort of style. I'm going to keep it back in the day. I'm going to go the Willie Pep versus Sandy Sadler. I think they had about 3 or 4 bouts, so if we can sort of cover a bit of that, that'd be great.
Wow.
Yeah, fantastic, and I'm sure, Mike, you'll be all over that. That should be a ripper. I must admit, I know about the fights. I can't remember actually sitting down and watching the highlights. I know I obviously read all about it and saw the pictures, but I've never actually seen them, so I'll be checking that out as well. So, Mike, I'm sure you'll be all over it and filling in the gaps where we can't.
Yeah, I love that pick. And, look, I think even if you're a fan of the sport in this era, you know about the accomplishments of Willie Pep.
Yep.
You hear of the legend of winning a round without throwing a punch. But I love this choice by Tassie because this is our chance to educate people about the great Sandy Sadler.
Love it, mate. Well, that's what this show's all about. So.
That's right. You can't talk Willie Pep without Sandy Sadler, Mike.
Yep.
So 100%.
Yep.
Right.
Nah, spot on. That's a great pick, mate. And look, maybe it'll be a bit of a trend. We've covered all that. I mean, it's a bottomless pit as far as the amount of fights we can go through over the years. But I really like this going way back in time because so many great fights.
No one's doing what we're doing.
Yeah.
No
agree,
one's
mate.
educating people. There's plenty of good, great. I'm not knocking anyone. Great Australian boxing sites, and they're all doing their bit for boxing. A lot of it's about current, recent fights, which is great. But we're educating people. We're taking people back to the archives and the legends, and like these guys paved the way for the Roy Joneses, the Mayweathers, the Pacquiaos, the De La Hoyas. So by Mike tonight and me next week, we're showing these true boxing fans. Learn about these guys. You know what I mean?
No, very well said. All right, guys, we'll leave it at that. That was a great choice, Mike. Really appreciate it, mate. That was Joe Lewis versus Billy Conn. And look out next week for Sandy Sadler versus Willie Pep. Thanks, guys. We'll see you then.